Outside Fallujah, Iraq, 2004. A U.S. Marine stands at a roadside halt alongside a Delta Force operator on a joint patrol. Dust on everything. Heat that makes the air feel solid. The Marine glances sideways at the operator's rifle. Something is wrong. The shape is right. The caliber is right. The size matches his own M4 almost exactly. But the stamping on the receiver does not say Colt. It does not say anything American. The Marine squints. He reads 2 letters, HK. He looks at the operator and asks where he got it. The Delta operator smiles, says one word, Germany. That single exchange captures something the Pentagon spent the next 16 years refusing to admit out loud. While every American soldier in Iraq was carrying an officially approved M4 carbine that had a documented tendency to malfunction in sustained combat, Delta Force was quietly running a German rifle the Army had passed on. And it would take confirmed combat failures, a string of dead soldiers, and the most publicized special operations raid in American history to finally force the institution to catch up to what those operators already knew. So the question is not just which rifle was better. The question is how an elite unit inside the United States Army looked at the rifle their own country issued, decided it was not good enough, and went to Germany to fix it. And how the Army watched that happen for over a decade before acting. That answer is not simple, and it is not flattering. To understand why Delta Force rejected the M4, you have to understand what the M4 actually is, not the marketing version, the mechanical reality. The M4 carbine uses a design principle called direct gas impingement. When a round is fired, burning propellant gas travels backward through a small tube that runs along the top of the barrel and feeds directly into the bolt carrier group inside the upper receiver. That gas pushes the bolt carrier rearward, ejects the spent case, and cycles the action to chamber the next round. On paper, it is elegant. Lightweight, few moving parts. Easy to manufacture at scale. The Army loved it. The M16 platform, which the M4 descended from, had been standard American infantry issue since Vietnam. Decades of procurement infrastructure. Decades of familiarity. Decades of political investment in the idea that this was the American rifle. But former operators who spent years running the M4 in combat will tell you exactly where that elegance breaks down. When you shoot sustained fire, the gas coming back through that tube is hot, dirty, and full of carbon residue from the propellant. It does not just cycle the action. It also coats the bolt and the interior of the upper receiver with fouling at a rate far faster than most soldiers expect. In a clean-range environment, this barely matters. You fire, you clean the rifle, you fire again. The problem is that combat is not a range environment. In a close-quarters engagement inside a building in Fallujah or a village in Kunar province, you do not get to stop and clean your rifle. You fire. You keep firing. And if the carbon builds up faster than the lubricant can compensate, the bolt starts to resist cycling. The action slows, and in a worst case, it stops entirely. Delta operators knew this problem long before it became a formal Army discussion. The unit's entire training culture is built around stress testing equipment under conditions that go well beyond anything standard military evaluation replicates. When former Delta operators describe the process of adopting a new weapon system, they are not talking about a committee review. They are talking about men who have personally run a rifle in situations where a malfunction meant someone died. Their feedback carries a weight that no lab test replicates. And their feedback on the M4 in sustained high-tempo operations was not positive. The most documented public case of M4 failure in combat came on the 13th of July, 2008, at Combat Outpost Collar near the village of Wanat in Kunar Province, Afghanistan. A platoon from the 173rd Airborne Brigade combat team was attacked by a large force of insurgents, some reports putting the attacking force at over 200 fighters. The firefight was intense and sustained. After-action reviews, congressional testimony, and Army investigations all documented the same pattern. Multiple soldiers reported their M4S malfunctioning during the firefight. Heat buildup, carbon fouling. Actions that stopped cycling during the most critical moments of the engagement. 9 American soldiers were killed. Numerous others were wounded. The malfunction reports were part of the official record. The Army acknowledged them. What the Army did not do was treat those malfunctions as evidence that the M4 itself had a fundamental design problem that needed to be solved before the next generation of infantry carried it into the same type of fight. Former operators who watched that investigation unfold will tell you the same thing privately. It is not that the Army did not know the M4 had a sustained fire weakness. It is that acknowledging that weakness officially carried consequences the institution was not ready to accept. That is where the HK-416 story starts. Larry Vickers is not a name that appears on official Army procurement documents. He is not a defense contractor, lobbyist, or a Pentagon policy analyst. He is a former Delta Force operator, a man who spent years inside the unit running the M4 in conditions that exposed its weaknesses firsthand. After leaving the unit, Vickers took what he knew about the rifle's failure points to Heckler & Koch, the German firearms manufacturer based in Oberndorf am Neckar. What came out of that collaboration was the HK-416. The engineering decision at the core of the HK-416 is a shift from direct gas impingement to a short-stroke gas piston system. The difference sounds technical. The real-world consequence is not. Instead of routing the burning gas back through a tube into the bolt carrier group, the piston system uses the gas to push a separate piston rod that is mechanically isolated from the bolt and chamber. The gas does its job, drives the cycle, and then vents out of the system before it reaches the receiver. The bolt group stays cleaner. The chamber stays cooler. The rifle runs longer between cleanings in high-volume fire situations without the fouling accumulation that stressed the M4's system. Heckler & Koch did not invent the gas piston concept. It had existed in various forms since the Second World War, including in the AK-47 platform that American soldiers had been fighting against for decades. What Vickers and the HK engineers did was apply that principle to a rifle that was dimensionally compatible with the M4. Same caliber, same magazines, similar ergonomics. It was not designed to be a completely new rifle. It was designed to fix the specific problem that former operators had identified in the field. Delta Force began evaluating the HK-416 in the early 2000s. By the time that Marine in Fallujah was reading the receiver markings on an operator's rifle in 2004, the unit had already made its decision. The HK-416 went to war with Delta operators, while the standard-issue Army rifle it was designed to replace remained the official choice for every other American soldier in the same theater. Now here is the part that former operators will describe with a particular kind of frustration when they talk about it years later. The Army knew. It is not that the M4's limitations were secret. There had been documented complaints from soldiers and units going back further than most official discussions acknowledged. The Army had conducted tests comparing the M4 to competing designs, including gas piston alternatives. Some of those tests showed the M4 underperforming in dust and heat and sustained fire scenarios. The results were known, the implications were understood. The institutional response was to continue issuing the M4. The reason comes down to arithmetic that has nothing to do with rifles. The United States Army at peak Iraq and Afghanistan deployments had hundreds of thousands of soldiers carrying M4 carbines. The supporting infrastructure, the spare parts supply chains, the armorer training pipelines, the maintenance protocols, all of it was built around the M4 platform. Switching the standard infantry rifle of the United States Army is not a decision measured in dollars. It is a decision measured in billions of dollars and years of logistical disruption. And the political cost of making that switch is not just financial. It is the admission that the rifle American soldiers had been carrying into combat for years had a design problem that cost lives in firefights. It is not that the Pentagon was incompetent. It is that the Pentagon could not afford to admit that the rifle every infantryman in America carried into combat was inferior to a rifle made by Germans for a unit they could not even publicly name. The political cost of that admission was higher than the human cost of the rifle. That calculation is not made by bad people. It is made by people inside a bureaucratic system where the consequences of admitting a systemic failure fall directly on the people responsible for making decisions, and the consequences of not admitting it fall on soldiers who will never testify to any committee. Delta Force operated in a different world. The unit's procurement culture, to the extent it has one at all, has always operated at a distance from standard Army acquisition processes. Special operations forces have maintained a degree of equipment flexibility that conventional units do not have, partly because their mission profiles are sufficiently different that uniform standardization makes less operational sense. When Delta evaluated the HK-416 and decided it was superior for their operational requirements, There was no committee that could override that decision by pointing to procurement contracts. The operators who would carry the rifle into the most demanding combat situations on Earth were the ones who decided what rifle they carried, and they chose Germany. From 2004 onward, the HK-416 was quietly accumulating a combat record inside the most demanding special operations environment in the world. Tier 1 units running the rifle through conditions that standard Army evaluations never replicated. High round counts in short time frames. Desert environments full of fine particulate matter that exploited every weakness in a direct gas system. Sustained close-quarters engagements where the rifle had to keep cycling through volume of fire that would have taxed an M4 badly. The HK-416's gas piston system handled those conditions differently. Cleaner bolt, lower heat accumulation at the chamber, more reliable cycling under the exact stress conditions that had caused documented M4 failures. Former operators who ran both platforms in that era are consistent on one point. It was not that the M4 was a bad rifle in normal conditions. In a standard infantry role with disciplined fire and regular maintenance cycles, the M4 was a reliable, accurate, effective weapon. The gap showed up specifically in the high-volume, sustained fire scenarios that special operations and intense infantry engagements produced. And in those scenarios, the gap was not subtle. Meanwhile, the conventional army continued to deploy with M4s. The Wanat engagement in 2008 was not an isolated data point. Reports of M4 malfunction in heavy engagements had been surfacing from multiple theaters since 2003. Congressional hearings addressed the issue. Army leaders responded by pointing to upgrades, improvements, and the overall reliability record of the platform across the broader force, which was not technically false. The M4 worked adequately for most soldiers in most engagements. The problem was that the soldiers who needed a rifle to keep cycling when a firefight ran hot and long were exactly the ones who could not afford the exception cases. The vindication that former Delta operators had been anticipating for years came from an operation most of them had no direct involvement in. May 2, 2011, Abbottabad, Pakistan. A compound in a residential neighborhood that had housed the world's most wanted man for years, while intelligence services on multiple continents failed to locate him. Operation Neptune Spear was the mission that ended Osama bin Laden's decade of evasion. The raid was conducted by Naval Special Warfare Development Group, known publicly as SEAL Team 6. The assault element that entered the compound that night was carrying HK-416 rifles. That is not a footnote. It is the operational signature of the highest-profile special operations raid in American history. The men the United States sent to execute the most consequential direct-action mission since the Second World War did not carry standard-issue M4 carbines. They carried the German-engineered rifle that Delta Force had adopted 7 years earlier, while the Army's procurement system was looking the other direction. The bin Laden raid did not change Army procurement policy overnight. Bureaucracies do not work on timelines calibrated to single operational events, regardless of how dramatic those events are. But the public nature of the HK-416's role in Operation Neptune Spear made a private argument into a public record. The rifle that America's most elite operators chose for the most important mission in a generation was not the rifle America's standard infantry carried. That contrast was now documented in public reporting, congressional briefings, and military media coverage in a way that made the institutional argument for status quo harder to sustain. The real vindication came more quietly, and it came from a different branch. The United States Marine Corps had been dealing with the same institutional debates about automatic rifle performance that the Army had been navigating for years. Their particular concern was the squad automatic weapon, the M249 light machine gun that provided sustained fire at the infantry squad level. The M249 was reliable in many roles, but carried its own limitations in the kind of close-range sustained fire that characterized the urban combat Marines encountered repeatedly in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Corps began evaluating alternatives. What they adopted in 2010 and expanded across the infantry force through 2017 was the M27 infantry automatic rifle. The M27 fires the same 5.56 cartridge as the M4 and M249. It uses the same magazines. It was designed to be familiar enough to integrate into existing infantry units without complete retraining. It is also, mechanically, a variant of the HK-416 platform. Different designation, different specific role, same core engineering. The same gas piston system that Larry Vickers and Heckler and Koch built into the HK-416 because a former Delta operator told them the direct gas system was failing in combat. The Marine Corps did not announce the adoption of the M27 as a reversal on M4 policy. They framed it as a capability addition, a more accurate and reliable automatic rifle for the infantry squad. But the technical lineage was not a secret to anyone paying attention. The rifle the Marine Corps chose to put in their infantry squads was built on the same operating principle as the rifle Delta Force had gone to Germany to get in 2004. The institution had finally caught up. It just never said so directly. That is the pattern that former operators describe when they talk about this history, and it matters beyond the specifics of any particular rifle debate. The unit that became Delta Force was built by men who believed that existing military structures would resist the kind of unconventional thinking that modern special operations required. That institutional resistance is not a relic of a different era. It is a permanent feature of how large organizations maintain coherence. A bureaucracy that can reverse every decision based on feedback from any subunit is not a functional bureaucracy. The rules that make institutional continuity possible are the same rules that make institutional adaptation slow. Delta Force's equipment choices have always been a proxy for a deeper argument about how military organizations learn from combat experience. The HK-416 story is one version of that argument. A small number of operators identified a problem, found an engineering solution, adopted it under their own authority, and accumulated a combat record that eventually became impossible to ignore. The lesson is not about rifles. It is about the gap between the speed at which combat reveals the truth and the speed at which institutions respond to it. That gap has killed soldiers in every war America has fought. It will kill soldiers in wars America has not yet fought. The only variable is how wide the gap is allowed to grow before the institution is forced to close it. Delta Force has always worked to keep that gap narrow, not through the official channels that large organizations use to update doctrine and procurement, through the blunter mechanism of operators who trusted their own combat experience more than any committee's consensus, and who were authorized to act on that trust in ways that conventional units are not. The next video on this channel breaks down how Delta Force operators identify the most dangerous person in any crowded room within seconds of walking in, and the specific behavioral cues they look for that civilians never notice. That video is on screen now. Subscribe if you want more of what actually happens inside special operations, not the version that makes it into official press releases. Here is the question worth sitting with. If you were the Secretary of Defense in 2005, and former Delta Force operators told you privately that the standard rifle issued to every soldier in your army was failing in sustained combat, would you have gone public, forced the switch, and absorbed the political consequences of admitting the problem? Or would you have quietly upgraded the M4 and waited? Tell me in the comments. Re-audit complete.